It was perfect in every way. If you'd planned a 1-hour exercise in losing public sympathy, but at the end of it, your mother sacks you.
It was just another episode of a beloved comedy show until one breaking news story changed everything. And one man said something so sharp, so perfectly timed, and so brutally honest that the entire room stopped. What happens when live television meets a royal scandal? What does it take to leave an entire audience completely speechless? Join us as we explore the moment Ian Hislop stunned everyone. The moment no one expected. Have I Got News for You had been running for decades by the time this particular episode aired, and most viewers tuned in expecting exactly what the show always delivered: clever jokes, sharp political digs, and a panel of witty voices pulling apart the week's headlines with practiced ease. The studio hummed with that familiar energy. See, the kind that comes from years of knowing exactly what kind of show this was and what kind of laughs it produced. The audience had settled in, the banter was flowing, and everything felt completely normal. The hosts kept things moving at the usual pace. The panelists traded barbs, and laughter rolled through the room in easy, comfortable waves. Nobody in that studio had any reason to believe this episode would be remembered any differently from the hundreds that came before it. Breaking news cut through the program like a cold wind through an open door. Something had just happened outside the studio walls. Something real, something significant. And suddenly the carefully rehearsed rhythm of the show was gone. The laughter dropped away. The room went still. Faces changed, eyes moved toward the panel, searching for a reaction, and waiting for someone to make sense of what had just landed. In moments like this, comedy either rises to meet reality or collapses under its weight. The audience could feel the tension building, that electric uncertainty of not knowing which direction things were about to go. Nobody knew Ian Hislop was already forming the words that would make this moment unforgettable. The news that changed everything. There are moments in public life that stop people mid-sentence. Moments so unexpected and so loaded with consequence that even seasoned commentators need a beat to process what they have just heard. And this was one of those moments. The news that broke during that episode of Have I Got News for You was not a rumor, not a leaked story, and not a piece of political gossip dressed up as fact. It was official. King Charles had made a decision about Prince Andrew, and that decision sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. The stripping of Andrew's titles was not a quiet administrative move buried in a royal announcement. It was a public statement, a signal from the monarchy itself that something had gone too far, that the damage had become too visible, and the distance needed to be placed between the crown and the Duke of York. For an institution that had spent decades managing Andrew's controversies behind closed doors, this felt like a door being thrown wide open, and nobody in that studio was quite prepared for what it meant. The audience felt it immediately, that sharp collective intake of breath that happens when a room full of people all realize something at the same time, because this was not entertainment anymore. This was history unfolding in real time, while cameras rolled and microphones stayed hot. The energy shifted from relaxed amusement to something far more charged, a mixture of disbelief, excitement, and the slightly uncomfortable thrill of witnessing something genuinely significant. For viewers at home, the moment carried the same weight because Andrew had been a controversial figure for years. But the monarchy publicly stripping a senior royal of his titles was a different level entirely, confirming what many had suspected, that behind the careful language and measured palace statements, something serious had been playing out. And now, the consequences were landing in full view of everyone. The panel sat with the news settling around them like dust after an explosion, sharp political minds rapidly sorting instinct, wit, and judgment. While the audience watched and waited for the first voice to cut through the silence, sensing that whoever spoke first was going to define how the room remembered this moment. Everyone was waiting, and one man had never once been known for staying quiet when it mattered most. The man known for no fear to understand why Ian Hislop's reaction carried so much weight that night. It helps to understand who Ian Hislop actually is, because his reputation was built long before that studio moment, and it was built on a foundation that most people in his position would never have dared to construct. Layer by layer, lawsuit by lawsuit, over several decades of saying exactly what he thought about exactly the people who least wanted to hear it. Hislop has been the editor of Private Eye since 1986. Oui, a satirical magazine that has spent decades saying the things that mainstream media frequently avoids, never softening its language for powerful people, never pulling punches to protect relationships or preserve access, and accumulating more legal threats than almost any other publication in British history. Hislop wore that record not as a warning, but as a badge, because every lawsuit and every angry letter from a politician's solicitor was simply confirmation that the magazine was doing its job, and he had no intention of stopping. His work on Have I Got News for You ran parallel to that editorial career, and the combination made him something genuinely unusual in British public life. Not a comedian pretending to care about politics, and not a politician attempting to be funny, but something entirely his own. Part satirist, he's part journalist, part moral voice. And the audience always sensed that what he said came from somewhere real, rather than from a writer's room or a press briefing. What made Hislop particularly sharp was his instinct for the moment when laughter and truth collide, and his ability to expose more about a public figure in a single perfectly timed observation than 1,000 column inches of straight reporting ever could. He had spent decades perfecting that timing until it felt almost effortless, and powerful figures had learned to be wary of him because of it. Politicians who sailed through friendly interviews sometimes found themselves dismantled in a single sentence on Have I Got News for You, and Hislop used the platform with the quiet confidence of someone who had already faced the worst that powerful people could throw at him. Sund absorbed it and kept going anyway. He had been watching Andrew's story unfold for years. He had plenty to say, and the only question was how hard the first blow was going to land. The first strike. When Hislop spoke, the room changed immediately, and there was no slow build, no careful warm-up, no testing of the audience's mood before committing to a position, because he came straight at the story with the directness that had defined his entire career. And the audience felt it the moment the words left his mouth, landing with the kind of weight that silences a room for just long enough to make the laughter that follows feel earned. His initial reaction to the news of Andrew's titles being stripped was sharp and immediate, sitting somewhere between a cutting observation and a barely disguised verdict. The kind of line that works because it says plainly what everyone in the room is already thinking, but has not yet allowed themselves to say out loud. Hislop had a gift for that, for finding the sentence that sat right at the edge of what was acceptable, and then delivering it with such precision that it felt less like a transgression and more like a relief. And the audience responded exactly the way audiences always did when someone said the true thing in the right way. The laughter had texture to it, not the easy rolling kind that follows a gentle joke, but the kind that comes with a slight edge of discomfort, the laughter of people who recognize that something true has just been said about someone very powerful, and who are not entirely sure whether laughing is the correct response, yet cannot help themselves anyway. Lily, that tension between amusement and unease was exactly where Hislop did his best work, and he knew it. The other panelists felt the shift too, because energy changes when something lands that well, and everyone on that set could feel the program moving into different territory. No longer a regular episode ticking through the week's news with practiced wit, but something sharper and more alive, driven by a story that was still unfolding and a voice that had no interest in handling it gently. What Hislop had done with that first remark set a tone, signaling clearly that he was not going to treat this story carefully, was not going to soften it or give Andrew the benefit of any doubt. And the audience was completely with him, leaning forward, ready for whatever came next. When comedy turned ruthless. There is a particular point in any great piece of satire where the jokes stop feeling like jokes, where the laughter in the room begins to carry something heavier underneath it, and the audience realizes they are no longer simply being entertained, but being shown something true about the world they live in. That point arrived during this episode, and it arrived quietly, almost without warning, slipping in between the punchlines like a blade between the ribs. Hislop pushed further, and that was always his method. Not to land a single blow and retreat to safer ground, but to keep pressing, keep questioning, keep pulling the thread until the full absurdity of a situation was completely exposed. He began pointing out the layers of Andrew's downfall, not just the headline moment of the titles being stripped, but the long and winding road that had led to it, a road lined with poor decisions, baffling public statements, and a spectacular inability to read how badly things were going. The audience laughter grew louder as he continued, but it also grew more complicated, carrying that unmistakable quality of people who are laughing because the alternative is simply too bleak to sit with. Hislop was highlighting contradictions that the palace had spent years trying to paper over, and hearing them laid out plainly with wit and without mercy made the whole situation feel both funnier and more disturbing than it had seemed before. The panel sensed it too, that slight recalibration that happens when a conversation lifts off the surface and starts going somewhere deeper. And the host kept the pace moving, but allowed Hislop the space to develop his point, because it was clear that what was being built here was bigger than a single gag. What Hislop understood, and what he demonstrated so effectively in these moments, was that satire at its sharpest does not exaggerate reality. It simply holds reality still long enough for everyone to get a proper look at it. Andrew's story did not need embellishment. It did not need dramatic reconstruction or fictional flourish, because the facts themselves were already extraordinary, already bordering on the unbelievable, and all Hislop needed to do was present them clearly and let the audience draw their own conclusions. The laughter was real, but the message underneath it was cutting deeper than anyone had quite anticipated. And the sharpest moment was still to come. Us to the line that stunned. The room. Every so often, in the middle of what appears to be a fairly ordinary exchange, a single sentence arrives that redefines the entire conversation. A line so perfectly constructed, so precisely aimed, and so ruthlessly timed that the room has no choice but to stop and absorb it before it can do anything else. This was one of those sentences, and the audience knew it the moment it landed. Hislop had been building toward it, layer by layer, each observation sharpening the next, each laugh loosening the room a little further until the atmosphere was primed and ready. And then he delivered it, a remark so cleanly targeted at the heart of Andrew's situation that it cut straight through every layer of royal protocol, every carefully worded palace statement, and every attempt the Duke had ever made to manage his own public image. The room froze for just a fraction of a second, that brief and beautiful pause that only happens when something truly unexpected has been said, when the brain needs a moment to catch up with what the ears have just heard. Then the laughter came, and it came hard, the kind of explosive release that fills a studio from floor to ceiling and spills out through the screen to everyone watching at home. The kind of laughter that has a little shock threaded through it because nobody quite saw it coming, even though, in hindsight, it was the only thing that could have been said. Even the host, a man who had seen and heard almost everything across years of broadcasting, visibly struggled to hold his composure, and that reaction mattered. Because it confirmed to the audience that what they had just witnessed was not a rehearsed moment or a carefully planned punchline, but something genuinely spontaneous, a live collision between a brilliant mind and a story that had handed him everything he needed. It was the kind of moment that gets clipped, shared, and quoted, the kind that follows a public figure forever. And it hit even harder because of everything that had already come before it in Andrew's very public and very damaging past. The shadow of the interview. To fully appreciate why Hislop's words landed with such force, it is important to go back a few years, back to a television moment that had already done enormous damage to Andrew's reputation long before that studio episode ever aired. A moment so memorably catastrophic that it had become a reference point in conversations about public relations disasters the world over. The BBC interview Andrew gave in November of 2019 was, by almost any measure, one of the most extraordinary pieces of television in recent memory. Not because it was brilliant, but because it was the opposite. A masterclass in how not to defend yourself when the questions being asked demand honesty and clarity above all else. Andrew sat across from the interviewer, apparently convinced that he could navigate his way through the conversation on charm and careful wording. And what followed was a series of answers so baffling, so tone-deaf, and so spectacularly ill-judged that they did not reduce the damage to his reputation, but multiplied it beyond anything his advisors could have imagined. The Pizza Express alibi became one of the most talked about details. Andrew's claim that he had been at a restaurant in Woking on a specific evening serving as his explanation for why he could not have been elsewhere. A defense so oddly specific and so difficult to verify in the way he presented it, that it immediately lodged itself in the public consciousness as a symbol of the entire interview's strangeness. The claim that he could not sweat due to a medical condition became another, circulating endlessly online and generating a level of disbelief that no palace communications team could contain. Hislop knew these details the way a surgeon knows an anatomy chart, and he used them with surgical precision, weaving references into his commentary in a way that reminded the audience of everything they already knew, connecting the present moment of Andrew's title stripping to the longer history of his public unraveling. Every callback landed because the audience carried the memory of the interview with them, fresh enough to sting, familiar enough to feel like shared knowledge between Hislop and everyone watching. The laughter that followed each reference was the laughter of recognition, but underneath it ran something more serious. A dawning awareness that the interview had not been an isolated disaster, but the beginning of a collapse that was still very much continuing. Myndigernkt. Scandal into satire. There is something particular that happens when a real scandal crosses over into the territory of public comedy, when the events surrounding a powerful figure become so widely known, so frequently discussed, and so impossible to ignore that they stop being news in the traditional sense and become something more like shared cultural shorthand, a set of references that everyone in the room already carries, and that a skilled satirist can activate with just a word or a raised eyebrow. Andrew's story had completed that crossing long before that episode aired, and Hislop understood exactly how to work with the material it had left behind. He began drawing out the absurdity of how ordinary places and ordinary things had been pulled into the orbit of a royal scandal, how a pizza restaurant, a nightclub, and a series of increasingly strained public statements had all become globally recognizable symbols of a very specific kind of failure. The audience laughed because they recognized every reference instantly, as because the story had saturated public consciousness so thoroughly that no explanation was needed, only the lightest touch of acknowledgement. What Hislop was doing in these moments was something more sophisticated than simply recycling old jokes. He was demonstrating how completely Andrew had surrendered control of his own narrative, how a man who had spent his life surrounded by the protection and prestige of the royal family had managed to turn himself into a punchline so durable that it had outlasted multiple attempts at rehabilitation and image management. The comedy was sharp, but the point underneath it was serious because losing control of your story, the way Andrew had, was not funny in any straightforward sense. It was a genuine and very public catastrophe. The audience laughed, but the laughter had that slightly hollow quality that comes from recognizing something uncomfortable about how far a person can fall and how quickly a reputation built over decades can be dismantled by a single interview. A series of poor decisions, and an inability to understand how the world outside the palace gates actually worked. Hislop was holding up a mirror, and the reflection was not flattering, but it was completely accurate, and the audience knew it, which was exactly why the laughter kept coming, even as the room grew quieter and more thoughtful around the edges. Reality, it turned out, was about to deliver a twist that made even this level of satire feel understated. When the story got serious, there is a moment in every great piece of live television where the mood shifts so completely that the audience can feel it physically, where the energy in the room drops from something bright and electric to something heavier and more still, and the laughter that had been flowing freely begins to catch in people's throats before it can fully form. That moment arrived in this episode with the quiet certainty of a door closing, and everyone in the studio felt it at the same time. Hislop's tone changed, not dramatically, not with any theatrical announcement that things were about to get more serious, but in that subtle and unmistakable way that happens when a naturally sharp mind decides it has finished warming up and is ready to say what it actually means. The jokes were still there, but they were thinner now, less padded, and the edges underneath them were harder and more deliberate, each observation landing with a weight that the earlier exchanges had not quite carried. The discussion moved toward the deeper and more troubling aspects of Andrew's situation, the connections and associations that went far beyond embarrassing interviews and clumsy public statements, the parts of the story that were not funny in any sense, and that no amount of comic framing could entirely soften. Hislop addressed them with the directness that had always defined him, not sensationalizing, not performing outrage, but simply laying out what was known and letting the audience sit with the full weight of it. the laughter in the room grew quieter and more uncertain, not disappearing entirely, but becoming more careful. As though the audience was instinctively recalibrating, recognizing that the conversation had moved into territory that deserved a different kind of attention. There was a stillness beginning to settle over the studio that felt less like discomfort and more like genuine absorption, people leaning in rather than pulling back, drawn by the seriousness of what was being said. What made Hislop so effective in these moments was his refusal to separate the comedy from the gravity, his insistence on holding both at the same time and trusting the audience to do the same, understanding that people are capable of laughing and thinking simultaneously, and that the best satire demands exactly that. The audience was no longer simply watching a panel show. They were watching a reckoning unfold in real time. And what happened next made the weight of it even harder to carry. Het very fall. No one could ignore. There are very few examples in modern public life of a reputation collapsing as completely and as visibly as Andrew's did, and fewer still where the collapse happened so much in plain sight, documented in real time by a media landscape that had neither the inclination nor any particular reason to look away. What Hislop was articulating in those moments on set was not simply a commentary on one bad interview or one poor decision, but an attempt to map the full scale of a downfall that had been building for years and had finally arrived at something close to its conclusion. Andrew had entered public life with every advantage available to a person in his position. The protection of one of the most powerful institutions in the world, in a lifetime of deference from those around him, and a set of titles and privileges that placed him beyond the reach of ordinary accountability. The distance between that starting point and where he now stood was not just large, it was historic, and Hislop framed it in exactly those terms, treating the moment not as gossip or entertainment, but as something that would be studied and discussed long after the headlines faded. The public's perception of Andrew had shifted so completely that it was almost impossible to remember how different things had once been. How he had moved through official engagements and public appearances with the easy confidence of someone who believed the world would always receive him warmly. How the palace machinery had absorbed and managed earlier controversies with practiced efficiency. All of that was gone now, all replaced by something irreversible. A settled public judgment that no communication strategy and no period of quiet withdrawal could undo. Hislop's framing of the collapse gave it a shape that the audience could hold on to, connecting the individual moments of failure into a single coherent narrative of a man who had been given every opportunity to course correct and had consistently chosen not to, whose downfall was therefore not a matter of bad luck or unfair treatment, but of compounding choices made over a very long period of time. The jokes carried consequence now, each one landing not just as a punchline, but as a small piece of evidence in a case that had already been decided, and the audience understood instinctively that they were watching the final chapter of something significant being written in real time. Now, one final moment remained, and it was about to seal everything permanently. By the time Hislop reached his last and most devastating observation, the room had been so thoroughly prepared by everything that came before it that the audience was almost holding its breath, leaning forward in that particular way that people do when they sense something definitive is coming, when the atmosphere tightens just enough to signal that the conversation is approaching its sharpest and most conclusive point. He delivered it with the calm precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment, not rushing toward it, not telegraphing it with any change in posture or shift in volume, but simply arriving at it naturally, as though it were the only logical place the conversation could have ended up. The observation cut across everything: the interview, the titles, the long and winding history of poor decisions and missed opportunities, and gathered all of it into a single point so cleanly made that the room had no defense against it. The audience reacted louder than they had at any point in the episode, and the quality of the reaction was different too, fuller and more complete, carrying within it the accumulated weight of every laugh and every quieter moment that had preceded it, as though everything the audience had felt across the program was finding its release in this one response. It was the kind of reaction that television producers spend entire careers hoping to capture, raw and unmanufactured, impossible to plan for and impossible to fake. So what made it land so completely was the sense that Hislop was not simply being funny, He was delivering something closer to a judgment, a final assessment of a situation that had been examined from every angle and had yielded only one honest conclusion. The comedy was still there, the timing was still immaculate, but underneath it was the unmistakable weight of something true being said plainly and without apology, and the audience felt both things simultaneously and responded to both at once. Even the panel seemed caught by it, that particular stillness that falls over a group of sharp and experienced people when one of their number says something that none of them could have said better. A moment of collective recognition that something significant had just occurred, and the moment that lives forever. The clip was online before the episode had even finished airing, shared and reshared across platforms by people who had watched it live, and immediately understood that what they had seen was not something that came along often. A convergence of the right story, the right voice, and the right moment, arriving together in a way that felt almost too perfectly constructed to have been accidental. Fans of the show called it one of Hislop's greatest ever moments, and that was not a small claim given the decades of material he had accumulated, but there was something about this particular exchange that stood apart from everything else, a quality of completeness that made it feel less like a highlight and more like a defining statement. The fullest expression of everything Hislop had always represented, distilled into a single unforgettable sequence. Andrew's story had already been one of the most dramatic in modern royal history, but Hislop's commentary gave it a final shape, framing the entire collapse in terms so clear and so precise that it became genuinely difficult to think about the story any other way afterward. The satire had not just reflected reality, it had crystallized it, turning a messy and sprawling public scandal into something with edges and weight and permanent form. One room, one broadcast, one voice with the courage to say exactly what needed to be said, and the entire audience, both in that studio and far beyond it, would carry the memory of it long after everything else about that evening had faded. Drop your thoughts in the comments section below, like this video, and subscribe for more incredible stories just like this one.